Orphanages, as we know them, began to emerge in large numbers in the early 1800s as America inched its way towards becoming a nation of industry. But, at the same time, America was almost completely devoid of social institutions for such things like health, public school systems, and placement of orphans or displaced children. As our population became more mobile, they began moving from one place to another, either looking for work or taking advantage of free land. In response, private charitable organizations, especially those sponsored by religious entities, became more popular. As time went on, many of these fell under the control of the state or county governments. These included those orphanages that took in children who were willingly or unwillingly abandoned by their parents. In Pensacola, Florida, most of the support for orphans came from donations from the general public. In larger municipalities, there emerged an orphan train movement that transported children by train from the crowded cities along the eastern seaboard directly to foster homes in rural areas of the Midwest. These trains operated between 1854 and 1929 and is said to have relocated from 200 to 250,000 children. One of the rising stars in Pensacola during this era was a woman by the name of Pearl Lappington. She was born in Alabama in 1866, the daughter of Abraham Milton Lappington and Texas Anna Pitkins. Her father would enlist in Montgomery, Alabama, on April 28, 1861 in Company C of the 1st Special Battalion of the Louisiana Infantry Regiment. However, the battalion disbanded in June 1862 and the men were transferred to other Louisiana units. 3 days before the Civil War ended, Abraham and Texas Anna married on April 6, 1865 in Cross Keys, Alabama, where Pearl was born. The Lappington family would return to Montgomery and eventually relocate once again to New Orleans. By 1877, the Lappingtons were in Pensacola, where Abraham supported his family as a laborer, and would remain, where he would eventually pass away in 1892, and was buried in the St. John's Cemetery. It should be noted here that Pearl's maternal side of the family was one of the cornerstones of the original Connecticut colony in America. The family's roots can be traced back to Hertfordshire, England, with the family's progenitor William Pitkins arriving in America in 1659. He was appointed the king's attorney for the colony of Connecticut before becoming the king's treasurer for next 15 years. His son William would become the colony's chief judge to their newly formed Superior Court. His son William III would also become a chief judge of the Superior Court from 1752 to 1764. In 1766, he was elected governor of the Connecticut colony. As the Lappingtons were making their way in Pensacola, they came into contact with a young man from Horsehead, New York in Chemung County. John M. Eagan was born in 1852, the son of farmers Patrick Eagan and Bridget Brown. His father received a Union Army pension, having enlisted on October 27, 1861, and fought with the Union's Company B of the 88th New York Infantry Regiment at the 7 Days Battle, and also Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Gettysburg. At the latter, Patrick was wounded. Young John Eagan had been a school teacher before heading south to Pensacola, where he began studying law under Colonel Joseph Paquette Jones. The colonel had once commanded the Confederate 17th Alabama Infantry Regiment during the war, and was now an attorney. Once John had graduated from the University of North Carolina, he was required to study under a certified lawyer such as Jones. John arrived in Pensacola in 1881, and following his tutelage under Jones, he was admitted to the Florida bar on April 24, 1882. 3 years later, after properly courting Miss Pearl, she chose to give up her seamstress job and married him on October 1, 1885. By this time, John had already been appointed postmaster of Pensacola on March 24, 1884 by President Chester A. Arthur, so his future political career was well in progress. When John completed his term as postmaster, he returned to law and politics and picked up where he left off. During this period of time, Pearl became heavily involved in the need to assist orphans in the Pensacola area. Most funding for orphans came from raffles and other social functions that were put together by Pearl and her group to raise money for the kids. This practice had always been the tried and true method before the arrival of Pearl, and even long afterwards. Many of these funding drives were coordinated by Pearl, as she became more and more involved in the issues of the orphanage. Having a high-powered attorney for a husband didn't hurt either, especially one with such high aspirations in politics. As time went on, she became a member of the WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union, that was organized in 1874. In 1893, the WCTU shifted their focus toward prohibition to fight the evil of alcohol consumption. On March 14, 1893, the WCTU came to Pensacola for a fundraising with the offer to divide the proceeds with Pearl's orphanage. To this end, Pearl volunteered to help organize a boating excursion in Pensacola Bay on that date. In the meantime, as the time neared, Pearl approached the outing with her usual exuberance and energy, as she performed tirelessly to make it a lasting success. Tickets were sold, reservations were made, passenger lists and donation amounts were tallied, food and drinks were stocked. By the end of the day on Tuesday, March 14, Pearl was utterly exhausted and returned home to 423 East Gregory Street, where she and John lived with her brother and mother. By Wednesday, March 15, she awoke with a severe headache. The pain increased to the point she went to her room and laid down around noon. She also asked one of her servants to please bring her a small bottle of chloroform from the bathroom. During this era, chloroform was used by the general population for every type of pain relief from a toothache, headache, upset bowels and on and on. Or you could order laudanum, another derivative of opium purchased over the counter from your local pharmacists, no prescription required. Both were very powerful when inhaled or ingested. When the bottle was brought to her, she applied a small amount to her handkerchief and placed it on her forehead and laid down. After a while, a family member came in and asked her how she felt. She replied, "Better," and went back to sleep. Around 2 p.m., John came home for dinner and asked about his wife. When informed that she was improving, he went upstairs to check on her. When he opened the bedroom door, the room was darkened, but he saw Pearl laying in an unnatural position across the bed. He also smelled the strong odor of chloroform. Attempts to revive her proved futile, so he called their family physician Dr. William H. Ross. Upon his arrival, he too found her unresponsive and called Dr. Frank G. Renshaw to come immediately with his galvanic battery. For its day, it was a type of portable shock device common between 1870 and 1920. When Dr. Renshaw arrived, he attached his electrodes and did his best, but to no avail. From the rigidity of the body, he estimated that she had been dead for about a half hour. Examination of the circumstances revealed that Pearl went to sleep due to the chloroform and with the bottle in her hands. As she drifted off, her hand relaxed, spilling the chloroform on her pillow, thus bringing about her death at the age of 26 years old. Pearl's funeral was one of the largest ever seen in Pensacola, and was attended by many of the most prestigious men and women in the community that attended the St. John's Cemetery services. Several months after Pearl's death, the king's daughters had built a fire under the Pensacola community to complete an orphanage in her honor. A concentrated effort was made to raise money for the building of an orphanage through the use of concerts, raffles, and dozens of other methods used to collect the needed funds. Colonel William Dudley Chipley donated a one-half block of land for its construction site in early July. And it was decided that due to Pearl's selfless work to build it, that it would be named in her honor. Prior to any legal or civic commitment, members of the King's Daughter were taking orphans into their own home at their own expense. One such angel was Mrs. Mary Susan Holland, known as Sue, who brought 7 orphans, between the ages of 5 and 11, into her care in April 1893 until more permanent arrangements could be made. On June 26, 1893, a committee made up of Mrs. Mary Adeline Spencer, Mrs. Ralphine Armstrong Fisher, Mrs. Charles Thompson, Miss Minnie Waite of Milton, and Miss Susan Pickens Simpson applied for a charter before Judge W. D. Barnes in Marianna, Florida. The charter was for the incorporation of a benevolent and charitable association to be known as the Pearl Eagan Home, to provide a home for all white destitute female orphans between the age of 3 months and 16 years old, and for all white destitute female orphans between the ages of 3 months and 16 years old from fallen and degraded women. The institution would be overseen by the above King's Daughters. So, who were the King's Daughters of Pensacola? Each circle belonged to an international order of the Daughters of the King, which functioned as a lay religious order for women. They were communicants of the Episcopal Church and churches in communion with it, such as the Anglican, Lutheran, and Roman Catholics. It was founded in New York City in 1885 with the first circle established in Springfield, Illinois in 1888. Each circle was responsible for their own mission. In 1892, the circles decided to combine their efforts into a single purpose. The daughters in Pensacola chose to set up a home for orphaned and abandoned female children as their mission. To this end, the circles incorporated in 1893 under the legal name of the King's Daughters. As of July 1893, prior efforts to assist the orphans came from monthly contributions from the groceries of Patrick McHugh, Joseph S. Roberts, John C. Green, E. Miller, the A. McDonald and William L. Moyer brothers, Henry Pfeiffer, and the Manuel F. Gonzalez Grain and Flour Company. Added to this list was weekly contributions from the meat companies of John S. Bell and the Jones brothers of Andrew H. and Charles W., along with the bakeries of Henry Waite and Jacob B. Spots. Regular contributions also arrived from the Henry C. Cushman drugstore, the brick masons of Lewis C. Bennett, bookkeeping from Robert J. Jordan, and a clerk by the name of Murdoch G. Morrison. To top it off, a fine stove was delivered from William Johnson, who ran a wholesale and retail dry goods and hardware store. And it was the King's Daughters, who were the driving force of the Pearl Eagan home, that resulted in the laying of their cornerstone on September 25. The stone had been donated to the cause by the Benjamin A. Davis Monument and Stone Works Company of Pensacola. At 4:30 p.m. on September 25, the president of the King's Daughters, Mrs. Mary Adeline Leach Spencer, wife of Joseph Willis Spencer, opened the cornerstone ceremony. The pastor of the Presbyterian Church, Dr. Henry Sale Yerger, gave the invocation and led the crowd in the singing of the hymn, How Firm a Foundation. Christ Church's Reverend Percival Hanahan Whaley offered Psalm number 121, followed by prayers given by the Methodist Church's Reverend William Posey Hurt. On the south side of the cornerstone, Robert Emmett Toll had engraved Pearl Eagan Home 1893. And on the east side, he cut into the marble stone, Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain who build it. Into the cornerstone, Mr. Toll had carved a receptacle, and inside they placed a copper box, as a time capsule made by Charles Vetter, with the following articles put inside: an account of the origin of the Pearl Eagan home, the King's Daughters minutes of March 2nd and April 20th, 1893, and the names of the building committee. Also there was an 1893 silver dollar, the Articles of Corporation and Bylaws, the Pensacola News-Journal edition of September 24th, a copy of the Pensacola Weekly Argus, a copy of the Pensacola Daily News on death of Pearl Eagan, a list of the King's Daughters, and a list of the Pearl Eagan officers and directors. But it does make you wonder whatever happened to that cornerstone. Finally, Reverend Pugh of the First Baptist Church thanked all of the contributors for the upcoming construction project. But it was the Jewish Ladies Benevolent Association who were the first to donate to the cause. Reverend Pugh also listed the other contributors as the Macmillan Lumber Company of Pine Barren, the Southern States Land and Timber Company, James McCullough of Quintet, the Simpson Company of Baghdad, the Chaffin Company of Milton, and the William B. Wright Company. There was also Oliver Bronham's Planing Mill, Robert J. Brent's Company of Bayou Chico, and the Mackenzie Erting Company of Pensacola. But remember, Pensacolians were not the only citizens that opened their hearts and purse strings to the orphan endeavor. The King's Daughters opened a circle in Milton composed of girls from 10 to 15 years old who were striving to become useful women in the world. With only limited funds, they donated a box of clothing to the Pearl Eagan home on October 25. Much of the lumber being used for the home's construction was to be donated by the numerous timber mills scattered throughout Escambia County. Those not already contributing were being called upon soon enough by the King's Daughters. On September 24, it was announced that the home's cornerstone would be laid the following day with great pomp and circumstance. To add to the growing influence of the king's daughters was the addition of 2 more circles to the fold. The Helping Hands Circle was organized by Mrs. Helen N. Waddell, who was the wife of a Presbyterian minister residing in Pensacola for a short period of time. They too took part in the Pearl Eagan Home project. Another was the Sunbeam Circle in Warrington, who pooled their funds and bought iron beds for $5 each plus 50 cents for individual name tags placed on the bunks. These additional circles made a total of 4 in the Pensacola and Milton area. With the home now in full operation, continued efforts were made to keep it supplied with necessary items for the children. On November 23, 1893, a baseball grudge match was to be played at the Palmetto Beach field between the fat players of Captain Thomas E. Wells versus the thin players of Captain Charles P. Levi. The rules required Wells' team to be 200 or more pounds each, and those of Levi at 120 or less. All proceeds were to be dedicated to the Pearl Eagan home. After the death of his wife Pearl, John would remarry again in 1897 to Nancy Nanny Louise Wentworth, the daughter of George Edgar and Susan Weatherby Parker Wentworth. Her father was a former lieutenant colonel in the Union Army, former Escambia sheriff and U.S. Marshal, and a well-known businessman and politician in Pensacola. 10 years after Pearl's demise, John was stricken with pneumonia on a trip to Washington, D.C. Shortly after arriving back home, he succumbed on January 30, 1903, leaving his wife Nanny and 6 children behind, as he was buried in St. John's Cemetery. By 1902, America was becoming a nation of industry, which in turn was creating more industrial accidents, therefore more children were being displaced. As for Florida, 400 homeless children would arrive in Jacksonville aboard the infamous orphan trains. These trains traveled all across the country to find suitable homes for the children, but the experiment was a dismal failure. As a result of this rising crisis, the Children's Home Society of Florida was created on November 17, 1902. And by 1920, even the Pearl Eagan home back home was looking for assistance, as their infrastructure was unable to keep up. They asked the Children's Home Society for help, and they responded by creating the West Florida Receiving Home that would serve the 9 counties west of the Apalachicola River. Admission into the home would be reviewed by the superintendent, Miss Kate Rodgers. The new home would have a baby section for children under the age of 2. There would also be a nursery for the 3 to 5-year-old kids and quarters for older girls and boys separated by gender. The large second-story porch would be screened for those with contagious diseases, such as measles. Each new applicant would be tested for hookworms, eye, ear, nose, and throat infections, and needed dental work. The days of the Pearl Eagan Orphanage are long gone, and throughout America the traditional orphanage has become extinct. But Pearl's sacrifice for the orphans of Pensacola is a testament to her selflessness and compassion. It's beautiful to see how her legacy has ignited a flame of dedication in others to carry on her noble work. Today, her endeavors are carried on by the Florida's Children's Home Society.